Welcome to Outside Views, and today we're diving into a question that could have profound implications for the future of the UK and Europe. Could talks on the UK rejoining the European Union start in 10 years? This topic has been making headlines recently, and it's largely thanks to Peter Mandelson, a Labour peer and former European Commissioner, who suggested that this conversation could begin much sooner than many expect. In a lecture given in Edinburgh, Mandelson laid out his views on the long-term prospects of the UK and the EU, and while he stopped short of predicting an imminent re-entry, he certainly opened the door to the possibility. So let's take a closer look at what was said and why this matters. Mandelson's argument boils down to this. While the UK is still in the thick of post-Brexit realities, the idea of rejoining the EU could be back on the table within the next decade. He was clear, though, that this wouldn't be a unilateral decision. It's not just a matter of the UK deciding it wants to come back. The European Union would need to be on board as well. And at the moment, according to Mandelson, the EU has had it up to here with us. That statement alone speaks volumes about the strained relationship between the UK and the EU post-Brexit. And the scars from the Brexit negotiations, the economic fallout, and the political turmoil in the UK have left their mark. But despite all this, Mandelson believes the economic damage caused by Brexit could eventually bring both sides back to the negotiating table. He emphasized that the hard Brexit pushed through by Boris Johnson has left the UK driving with the economic handbrake on. That's a powerful metaphor, and it captures the frustration many feel about the economic consequences of the Brexit deal. We've all heard about the trade barriers, the higher costs, the red tape that businesses now have to deal with when trading with the EU. And while Brexit wasn't the sole factor contributing to the UK's economic challenges, it certainly didn't help. And Mandelson pointed out that the UK is the only member of the G7 group of wealthy nations where investment is below 20% of GDP. That's a sobering statistic and highlights just how much work needs to be done to get the UK's economy back on track. So where does that leave us when it comes to rejoining the EU? Mandelson's view is that while the prospect of re-entry is still a long way off, the conversation could begin in 10 years' time. Now, it's important to note that this wouldn't be the end of the process. It would just be the beginning of a new conversation about the UK's relationship with Europe. He was clear that rejoining the EU or even renegotiating a closer relationship would be incredibly difficult. The political will on both sides would need to be there, and right now, that simply isn't the case. But Mandelson's comments do raise an interesting point. The longer the economic damage from Brexit continues, the more likely it is that future governments will have to reconsider the UK's place in Europe. And that brings us to Keir Starmer. Starmer, the current Prime Minister, has been very clear in his position. He has no intention of rejoining the EU, the single market, or the customs union. In fact, before the general election, he went as far as to say that re-entry wouldn't happen in his lifetime. That's a strong statement, and it seems to rule out any possibility of a shift in policy, even if Labour wins a second term in government. But Mandelson's remarks suggest that Starmer's position might not be the final word on the matter. As Mandelson put it, the idea of reversing Brexit is still relevant, particularly given the long-term economic impacts that the UK is now facing. And that is something that cannot be ignored. Brexit was sold to the public on the promise of greater control, better trade deals and economic prosperity. But the reality has been far more complicated. Many of the economic benefits that were promised have failed to materialize, and the costs of Brexit are becoming increasingly clear. And Mandelson made it clear that in the meantime, the priority has to be on reducing the damage caused by Brexit. And that means focusing on mitigating the higher barriers that have been created to the UK's largest market, the European Union. He was particularly supportive of the proposals put forward by Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, to reset the UK's borrowing rules and leverage private finance to promote greater investment. It's a pragmatic approach, but it's also a sign that the UK government is aware of just how much ground needs to be made up. So, if the UK did begin talks on rejoining the EU in 10 years, what would that process look like? Mandelson was careful to point out that starting a conversation doesn't mean an immediate resolution. It would take time, it would take negotiation, and it would depend on rebuilding trust and mutual respect between the UK and the EU. And that is definitely no small task. The EU, as Mandelson said, is still dealing with the fallout from Brexit. The negotiations were long and painful, and there's little appetite in Brussels for reopening those wounds. But that doesn't mean the door is completely closed. As Mandelson noted, the global political landscape is constantly shifting. What happens in the United States, in Europe, or elsewhere in the world could bring the UK and the EU closer together in ways we can't yet predict. For example, defense and security cooperation could be one area where the UK and the EU find common ground, particularly in light of ongoing geopolitical tensions. So while the idea of rejoining the EU might seem far-fetched right now, it's not entirely out of the question. What's clear is that the economic and political realities of Brexit are far from settled. And as those realities continue to evolve, so too will the UK's relationship with Europe. And Mandelson's comments offer a glimpse of what the future might hold, but they also serve as a reminder that Brexit wasn't the end of the UK's European story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, although it could have been one of my horror stories. The key question now is whether that chapter will ultimately lead to reconciliation or whether the UK and the EU will continue to drift further apart. As always, only time will tell. And today I just want to use the occasion for a little reminder. On Outside Views Books, I do some horror stories now, original Outside Views horror stories. And so I would like to see a lot of you there. One of the little stories I put in a post here on this channel was Brexit Demons. It's a different kind of the Brexit story. And if you haven't seen that, you might want to look. But at the moment, there's even a series running. So every video I bring is like one chapter of a full book that will unfold over time, and they're all connected to each other. So if you were ever interested in some little horror stories, they are quite soft, I have to get, but it's like I did write books when I was 16, and I thought that would be another nice addition to my channels, and I really have fun doing those videos. And so if you haven't watched any of them, please visit Outside Views Books as well. And I would be happy about your support, more viewers, more subscribers, and of course your comments on the stories would really interest me. And of course I would be interested in your comments here as well about the idea of Mandelson and a start of talks in 10 years' time. Until next time, and the next video is right here in the end screen.